Are they just...
Well, one of the things I talk about in Patience with God is just how seductive it was to me. I mean, I'm not pointing the fingers at other people. Anybody that reads Patience with God will know the person I'm toughest on is me. I understand all too well where Sarah Palin comes from. I was out there in the 70s and early 80s pulling down those big honorariums, not the size she's getting, but, people were sending their private jets to fly me places, too, just the way Billy Graham's son Franklin did a few months ago to fly Sarah Palin down to meet with his old failing father to talk his dad into signing a document to endorse her. When his dad had avoided politics ever since he made the big mistake of backing Nixon and, spent his whole life running away from that. And now, his son is so mired in trying to pull people into this religious right, far right politics of the unhinged element of the Republican Party, which Sarah Palin represents, with all her death panels and saying that if you don't vote for her, the Republicans, you're not a real American and all this nonsense. What we see really, and what's sad for me to see, and what I talk about in the book, is the fact that obviously all this lingo and this extremism we're seeing recycled by people like Sarah Palin and the family, I've seen before. And worse than that, unfortunately, I had a lot to do with my dad back in the 70s and 80s of creating this climate of polarization where we're demonizing and writing off people, be they gay, immigrants, blacks, people who are non-Christians, those who don't believe what we believe. We put this in motion. We're the folks who went out there with the pro-life cause and said, look, if you think that a woman ought to have a choice, then you're no better than a Nazi. And we put that lingo in place. And so now when I see people putting posters up with Hitler mustaches on our president or bumper stickers quoting a psalm out of context, that if you read what the psalm says, calls for the president to be either assassinated, and it seems they're trawling for assassins with these kind of things, or at least hope that he dies and leaves his wife a widow and his children fatherless, which is what the psalm calls for. Sadly, I well remember Dad and I not doing anything that crazy or extreme, but very much being part of the group along with Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, James Dobson, and others that opened the door to turning Christianity in America into really just a hate movement when it comes to how it regards the other, in quotation marks. And you can fill in the blank. That can be black people for some bigots. It can be gay people for other bigots. It can be immigrants for other bigots. It can be women if people are misogynist. It can be just liberals or the other, or even folks who go to university, for all those people homeschooling their kids out there who fear higher education because they fear questions and they want to make sure their kids are never exposed to an alternative way of looking at things. And so that's the subculture in Patience with God that I address. But I don't address it just to write it off, and I'm certainly not a Bill Maher just making fun of everybody who I disagree with. Rather, I'm trying to present a real alternative that still is spiritual, that says, look, you don't have to become an embittered Christopher Hitchens and sort of flip the hate in the other direction. There's a different way to do this, and for me personally, I tell stories about playing with my grandchildren and a teacher who, when I was 11 years old, opened so many doors for me, and the good parts of what my parents did, and so forth, and just say, look, we have examples in our own lives we can look to what it means to be a spiritual person, and it isn't doctrine or correct belief. Who can believe correctly? None of us live long enough to know anything. We can hope some things, and that's about it.
And not many have come back to tell us about it. There is a fine line between atheists and fundamentalists, and they're a lot alike in the same way. They just have the absolute answer. And I think you're talking more to a middle that doesn't have an absolute answer. So let's see, on January 25th, the news basically broke about the military gun sites that had Bible verses on them.
Right.
And it's so shocking to me. I was raised in a church that I really, truly loved. I won Bible Bowl champion for the state of Alaska. I was on this team, and it was like the Jeopardy of Bible verses. And I never remember finding anything in there that was just like, look, if they're a little bit brown, shoot them.
Yeah, but it's so odd because now you're talking to me. I have to put on a different hat here because I'm talking to you as someone who was raised in the fundamentalist world. I also happen to be the very proud father of a United States Marine who served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, 1 in the Horn of Africa, and now he's out, happens to be the father of my little granddaughter Lucy, and he's living in the Boston area where I am right now. But I can tell you it just infuriated me because those dumb idiots who thought they were, doing something for the Lord, quote unquote, by putting little cute Bible verse references on gun sites for our special forces for, and our Marines and everybody else, you know, obviously what they were doing is just basically waving a big red flag and saying, you know, to all you paranoid, crazy Islamist terrorists out there who already think you're in a vast conspiracy of crusaders against Islam worldwide, we just want to prove it to you that you're not so paranoid and that we really are crazy Christians coming after your countries or whatever. Even from the point of view of common sense or military security, talk about the Danish cartoons and the reaction to those, you know, this was just so counterproductive and so unpatriotic, because essentially what you're doing is putting our men and women in uniform at risk so that you can get your jollies off putting a Bible verse on a gun sight, as if that's going to do anybody any good. So it was disgusting any way you slice it. And it also just points up this whole problem, and that is we've got this militant, crazy attitude in the far right of the Christian movement that I talk about in Patience with God as well, which, you know, is quite willing to see Armageddon happen and is pushing for that kind of chaos on every level. So that, you know, they'll put gun sights with Bible verses on them. They also root for the peace process to fail in the Middle East so Jesus will come back quicker. And let's just call it what it is. This is religious insanity. It's mania. And really, the fact that we have a separation of church and state just never seems to have occurred to these folks. It's a disaster. It's a disaster any way you slice it, and it's just symptomatic of a much, much larger problem. But boy, oh boy, did that particular one rile me up just because of all the young Marines that I happen to know because of my son.
Well, it seems to me that you call it religious insanity. I think it is remarkably arrogant to think that, you know, hear these verses come like a thief in the night, or all these sort of when God comes back, but they're willing to manipulate it. They're willing to kill people to manipulate the timeline of God. Like, who the hell do they think they are? It's just this arrogance and this sort of putting themselves on some sort of powerful level. I mean, they've gotten so strong, and I understand that. But the fact that they've gotten strong enough that they think that they can work God into this deal, because I remember seeing those charts with all of the Bible verses lined up next to the headlines.
Yeah,
certainly during their
trying to prove a point. The only crazy thing is you will remember, because you were there just like I was, and I also talk about in the book, because I have a whole section on this kind of crazy view of the end times. And, you know, if you go back to Hal Lindsey, that was the original guy who was writing all these nutty books in the 70s and 80s, like The Late Great Planet Earth, which were then ripped off and repackaged as these Left Behind novels that are now 16 volumes and video games and all the rest. You know, these poor goofs had to keep changing their timeline because, of course, he was claiming that the Soviet Union was the Antichrist. Well, now that's gone. And then his followers said, well, Mikhail Gorbachev was the Antichrist because he had a mark on his head. And, you know, that's laughable, except when you realize that there are people who believe this stuff in the Congress of the United States, living in places like C Street, making legislation. And not to put too fine a point on it, you know, Sarah Palin's there in her church having a pastor pray over her to cast demons and witches out and bind evil before she runs for governor. So, you know, we got someone who got a heartbeat from the vice presidency of the United States and might still do it. I don't think most Americans understand that this country is never more than a breath and a heartbeat away from a theocracy.